The Maine GOP convention got underway today in Augusta. The convention gives delegates a chance to hear from candidates for U.S. Senate and Maine governor. Senate candidates took the stage today, outlining their priorities and discussing the future of the Republican Party in Maine. The GOP also took time to remember members of the party that have died since the last convention, including Representative Kathy Javner. The Maine GOP chair says the gathering is a reminder the party is growing.
Well, I think the future of the Republican Party is outstanding. We have a lot of people who are finally realizing that sitting home and letting other people vote is killing them and killing the economy. People just can't afford it anymore. So I think we've added Republicans in both areas of the state, the North and the South. The party's picking up numbers. I think we're doing really good.
The convention will continue tomorrow, where the remaining gubernatorial candidates will get their time to speak.